Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We have a special welcome for this panel of three experts on nuclear issues. First, Madelyn Creedon, to my immediate left, Franklin Miller, and Daryl Kimball. Today we have what I think is really an exceptional panel for an exceptional theme that isn't discussed an awful lot these days and hasn't been discussed for a very long time. The era that we've all enjoyed of peace and relative stability that was ushered in by the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is more or less over. Two authoritarian states, Russia and China, are actively challenging the world order as led by the United States. I don't have to mention Russia's war in Ukraine and China's threats to stability in Asia are occurring in plain view. And so is China's nuclear weapons buildup. In little over a decade, China's nuclear force could be at parity with the U.S. nuclear deterrent. The question is what the U.S. response will be. More nukes, more conventional forces? What about arms control? Our first two speakers helped write the congressional study that is the basis for our discussion tonight. It came out in the autumn. It advises a change in American strategy and in the American nuclear force structure, and in fact in the force structure overall. Madelyn Creedon, who chaired the commission, has held senior positions in the Departments of Defense and Energy during the Obama administration. She oversaw policy development in areas like missile defense, nuclear security, cybersecurity, and space. Franklin Miller served and he's second to my left, served 7 secretaries of defense of both parties in a career of more than 30 years. He was directly in charge of U.S. nuclear deterrence and targeting policy. He chaired NATO's senior nuclear policy committee, and he was on the U.S. Defense Policy Board. He's now a member of the U.S. Strategic Command's Strategic Advisory Group. Oh, that's a hard one to put together. And is a principal of the Scowcroft Group, a consulting firm named for the late Brent Scowcroft, one of the great national security advisors in U.S. history, I think. Finally, Daryl Kimball, to my far left, has led the Non-Partisan Arms Control Association for more than 20 years. He has campaigned against new nuclear weapons programs and in favor of negotiations and ratification of major arms control agreements, including the New START agreement with Russia in 2010. So I would like to begin with Madelyn, if we could. Just a prompting question, if I could, which is the nuclear balance was and maybe still is called the balance of terror. Is it no longer in balance? Is there any way other than a nuclear buildup to put it in balance? And just how many additional nukes are needed? Over to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think with that, I'll just launch into the discussion about the report. But thank you very much for being here. And thank you all for being here. Having a forum like this to discuss these issues really is important. It's a pleasure for me to be here this evening with Frank Miller, one of my fellow commissioners, and also Daryl Kimball, who I've known for a long time. And we've worked together on a variety of different arms control and nonproliferation issues over the years. So the report that we're here to talk about tonight is the Strategic Posture Commission. And I guess I should note from the outset that the report is by the Strategic Posture Commission, not the Nuclear Posture Commission, but the Strategic Posture Commission. And I think that's important as we go through this tonight. So the report was the work of 12 commissioners appointed by 12 members of Congress, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. We had 6 men and 6 women. And for those of you who are into this data, it's 4 women and 2 men were appointed by Democrats, and 2 women and 4 men were appointed by Republicans. So, the vice chair was John Kyle, the former senator from Arizona. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the great work and support from our executive director, Bill Chambers, and the Institute for Defense Analysis. Our report was a consensus report. And I think this is really important. That wasn't an easy feat. And frankly, when we started, because it's a very disparate group of commissioners, I didn't think we were ever going to get there. But the fact that we did with this disparate group, I hope might be a lesson, maybe even for Congress, but who knows. But before we get into the details of the report, which was published last October, I wanted to do just a little bit of scene setting and background. So we're the second Strategic Posture Commission. In 2008, the first Strategic Posture Commission was appointed. Congress was coming off some fairly contentious debates on nuclear systems and policies, including 2 proposals for 2 nuclear weapons, and a very substantial debate on whether these systems would make nuclear use more or less likely. The START I Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty between the U.S. and Russia, had been signed in 1991, and it was about ready to expire in December of 2009. And if that happened, when that happened, there would no longer be anything in place to constrain the strategic warheads of either Russia or or the U.S. An election was coming in November of 2008, and there would be a new administration the following January. The Cold War had been over for more than a decade. The cooperative threat reduction programs with Russia, programs that helped to reduce and secure nuclear weapons, nuclear delivery systems, and materials were all coming to a close. The Russian economy was expanding, and Russia was several years into a modernization effort of its nuclear forces. And it was time for a comprehensive review and assessment of U.S. nuclear policy, posture, and force structure. So Congress established that first Nuclear Posture Commission in 2008 to conduct the review. They issued their report in 2009 with over 150 recommendations. I should note we were much more succinct. We only had 81. In retrospect, 2 significant themes, though, stand out from that report. The first is that the relationship with Russia was seen as hopeful, with real opportunities for collaboration and joint efforts to reduce the size of the respective nuclear arsenals and reduce reliance on nuclear weapons generally. The second point is that the report focused on Russia. There was almost no mention of China in that 2009 report. The policy considerations on which the first commission was most focused were also very different. In 2009, the policy balance was between the need to maintain an effective nuclear deterrent on the one hand, and on the other, lead international efforts to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation and to reduce the saliency and the number of nuclear weapons globally. That commission also hoped that the world would head in a direction in which proliferation and nuclear terrorism were reduced and where there was cooperation amongst major powers to ensure strategic stability. In fact, what they said was that they rejected the vision of a world defined over the next decade or 2 by a renewal of competition for nuclear advantage among the major powers. President Obama's 2009 Prague speech and the Obama administration's 2010 Nuclear Posture Review reflected much of that optimism while reinforcing the need for a safe, secure, effective, reliable, and credible nuclear deterrent. Indeed, by April 2010, the U.S. and Russia had signed a new START treaty, the New START Treaty, which placed limits on operationally deployed strategic systems and warheads and took the place of the START I Treaty that had expired in December of 2009. While there were still significant problems in the U.S. relationship, there was a view, a hope, maybe, that additional arms control agreements would follow and that the risk of nuclear confrontation would be diminished. At the same time, however, the U.S. also started on a much-needed nuclear modernization program for each of the legs of the triad, air, sea, and land. But as planned, the U.S. modernization effort was sized to meet the limitations of the New START Treaty. Fast forward 14 years, and it's a very different world. The scenario that the first commission hoped to see not only didn't come to fruition, but Russia and now China have gone in the opposite direction. Tensions and the probability of nuclear use, while still low, have actually increased. Russia, of course, has sought has sought to cajole and coerce Ukraine and others with the prospect of nuclear use, going so far as to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. And China is in the midst of a rapid expansion of its nuclear programs, developing its own triad for the first time. So as a result, in 2021, as part of the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress once again sought a review and assessment of U.S. nuclear policy, strategy, and force structure, and established our commission. One of the interesting things in our charge, however, was that Congress wanted us to look at new peer competitors of the U.S., peer and near-peer nuclear competition. And what that translates really into is that this new peer that they were talking about really is China, because this is the substantial difference from the time that we were in when the last Strategic Posture Commission issued their report. So as China has now substantially expanded its nuclear weapons program, and if it stays on its current trajectory, it will be a peer nuclear power in about a decade or so. Thus, for the first time, the U.S. will need to deter two nuclear peers, which is a significant change in the political landscape from 2009, and frankly, a situation that we've never faced. So our report provided high-level guidance to shape future decision-making, and it generally refrains from choosing specific systems. We provided characteristics of recommended capabilities, but did not pick winners or losers. And although the report is hard-hitting, it's also fairly subtle. And this subtlety has led to some conclusions and confusion about what the report does and does not recommend. So to be clear, we are not recommending substantial increases in the U.S. nuclear forces. And we do not endorse a new nuclear arms race. We do, however, support additional conventional forces. And we do support continued diplomatic efforts to reduce risk and increase strategic stability. And we are not abandoning arms control and related efforts, such as transparency and confidence-building measures. It's a hard fact, unfortunately, that hopeful environment and vision of widespread nuclear reductions from 15 years ago is no longer realistic, and the prospects for agreements on nuclear arms control appear bleak. Russia has pulled out of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. It has unratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and it has now suspended the New START Treaty. Moreover, we are on the brink of not having any bilateral strategic arms control agreement with Russia when the New START Treaty expires in 2026. There is no provision for an additional extension of New START. It's already been extended once, and so if there were to be a treaty, it would have to be a new treaty, and it would have to face new ratification and consent by the U.S. Senate. In the current political environment, this could be very difficult to achieve. China has also shown little to no interest in traditional arms control, although there have been discussions between Xi and Biden, particularly those last November, seem to have made some small progress towards transparency. But let's turn for a minute to the threat, which really is the underpinning of our report. So we have a whole chapter on the growing threat from China and Russia, plus North Korea and Iran. But it's important to understand what each country is doing to upend the global order. We focus mostly on Russia and China, and we all know that the threats from Russia and China are different, but each is growing and expanding. Today, the U.S., as I mentioned, is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting for which we did not plan, and we are not well prepared. So as a result, the Commission was very focused on being prepared and laying the foundation now for decisions in the future. We want to ensure that future decision makers can make decisions, that they actually have options to implement. To meet this challenge, the U.S. must maintain its leadership role in the world, preserve the rules-based international order, stay aligned with allies, a considerable strategic advantage that we enjoy, and deter conflict. Most importantly, we have to credibly deter nuclear conflict. But to do that, the U.S. has to build a strategic posture that has the highest probability to secure and further U.S. vital interests into the future, as well as prevent a regional or major conventional war and prepare to deter two adversaries simultaneously. What the U.S. does now and in the next few years will enable that flexibility that will most likely be needed to reshape the conventional and nuclear forces. So I think I'll stop there because our emphasis really is on deterring conventional war so that we never get into a war, and so the possibilities of getting into a nuclear war are reduced.
And as to the question, how many more nukes? I take it the commission did not come to an agreement on that.
We did not, and we also had a lot of discussion about what our program of record is, our triad, and we're very clear that modernizing our program of record, our triad, new bombers, new submarines, new ICBMs, is very important, and that's sufficient, but it may not be enough. But remember, that triad was sized to meet the constraints of the New START Treaty, which is 1,550 operationally deployed warheads. So even if we have to deploy a few more, we don't have to increase the total size of our stockpile. And that's a very subtle difference.
And how many warheads will China have in a decade's time?
So that's a good question. The intelligence community has put out a number of different guesses. One of the assumptions is that within a decade, they'll have somewhere on the order of 1,550. But when we had our briefings with the intelligence community, one of the things that we found most interesting is the intelligence community told us that they are often wrong in their estimates of China. So instead of, for instance, and I'll just make something up, if they said China would get 10 things in 5 years, invariably China would get 15 things in 3 years. So China is building more faster than RIC has been able to estimate.
Underestimating. Frank, let me turn to you. You're the expert on deterrence and targeting. If you add new weapons to the arsenal, then they'll obviously be directed at targets, and I assume new targets in China and Russia. How many new targets do you think have to be added? Where are they? What are they? And I don't expect you to tell me, but I should put the question to you anyway.
Okay, thanks for the question, for putting the target on me. So that's not what I plan to talk about. I will talk about some other things, but to answer your question succinctly, I recently wrote an article for The Economist where I called on the administration to come up with its answer to your question. So I'm not going to give you an answer to that question. It's a pleasure for me to be back here. I was here. Yes, I can. All right, so there. I love lecterns. I don't love this. So this is my fourth time in front of the council, and thank you for bringing me back. And I want to follow on from Madelyn's remarks because I want to talk about what the Posture Commission did not say. After the commission report was published, it was caricatured in many publications, and I want to set the record straight. So the first thing is, as Madelyn said, the report does not call for a major increase in the number of U.S. nuclear weapons. In fact, the report does not call for any increase in that number. While some of the commissioners, including myself, believe a modest, and I say again, a modest increase is required, the commission did not take a position on this. And as has been falsely alleged, we certainly did not say the United States needed a nuclear force as large as the nuclear forces of China and Russia combined. Second, the commission did not call for a major increase in funding for U.S. nuclear weapons programs. A careful reading of the report will show that the commission's recommendations fall into several phases, the first of which call for increased spending on two conventional programs and on enhancing the defense industrial base and the nuclear weapons industrial base. Mindful as we were of the likely impending delay of the deployment of new U.S. land-based missiles, ballistic missile submarines, and bombers, and aware of the need to retire some of their aging predecessors, thereby resulting in a warhead shortfall, the Commission did recommend that the Defense Department be ready to add existing warheads or stored warheads to existing systems once the New START Treaty expires. Only in the out years, which is to say the late 2030s and 2040s, does the Commission recommend extending the extant modernization program for strategic submarines, bombers, and air-launched cruise missiles. The only new capability the Commission recommended was a midterm effort to enhance U.S. regional nuclear deterrence. Finally, the Commission's recommendations do not, as has been claimed falsely, create the basis for a new arms race. Such claims are laughable and completely unsupported by the facts. So let's reset that stage. Our strategic triad of land-based missiles, strategic submarines, and bombers was first deployed in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They were replaced with modern systems in the Reagan years. They should have been similarly modernized during the presidency of George W. Bush, but they were not. Recognizing that the existing systems could not operate indefinitely, the Obama administration, in light of the geostrategic situation at the time, which Madelyn has described, created the basis for modernizing the triad in the late 2020s and beyond. As of this moment, no new U.S. nuclear systems have been deployed in this century, and nor will any be done until the late 2020s. The United States has not fielded a new nuclear weapon system in the last 24 years. Since 2008, however, Russia and China have been embarked on major upgrades to their nuclear forces. In fact, last December 2023, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu reported to the press that modern weapons and equipment now make up 95% of Russia's nuclear triad. Russia today is fielding new types of land-based missiles, new types of submarine-launched missiles, a new air-launched cruise missile. It's reopened a bomber line. It's got new ballistic missile submarines in the water, and it's deploying a host of dual-capable mid-range systems. China is deploying, again, to be very clear, fielding new types of land-based missiles, new types of sea-based missiles, new types of ballistic missile submarines, and it's got the most dynamic ballistic missile program in the world. Here are the facts. The number of new types of land-based missiles deployed since 2010, Russian Federation 4, China at least 3, the United States 0. Earliest deployment of the replacement for Minuteman, probably 2030, if we're lucky. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, number of new types the Russians are deploying, 2. China, 2. The United States, 0. Strategic missile submarines. New submarines commissioned in the last 2 decades. Russia, 7. China, 6, plus a new class in early construction. The United States, 0. The earliest replacement boat comes in 2029, if we're lucky. Strategic bombers. Russia is deploying a new air-launched cruise missile for its bomber force. It's reopened its Blackjack strategic bomber line and has begun modifying an older bomber, the Blackjack, for intercontinental missions. China is developing a new bomber and has likely deployed a new strategic air-launched ballistic missile. The U.S. has begun building a new bomber for deployment late in this decade and has proposed building a new air-launched cruise missile for deployment mid to late next decade. So what does all that tell you? First, that Russia and China have been upgrading their nuclear forces for well over a decade without any U.S. counterpart programs. As President Obama's last Secretary of Defense, the late Ash Carter, remarked in 2017, there is a nuclear arms race, but the United States is not in it. What he meant to say is that there's a new nuclear arms race to the degree it exists between Russia and China. It also tells you that it is culturally arrogant and factually incorrect to suggest that Russian and Chinese nuclear decision makers have no independent ideas of their own and only react to U.S. programs. And it should make clear that whatever the United States must do to replace an aging deterrent, a deterrent which is reaching the end of its useful life, cannot by any stretch of imagination be perceived as stimulating a new nuclear arms race. So let me wrap up by reemphasizing a point Madelyn made. The Commission spent a great deal of time looking at intelligence reports and speaking to senior commanders and diplomats. The world has changed dramatically, and for the worse, since the mid-2010s. The United States and our allies do face an unprecedented threat. There are 2 hostile and aggressive, and I repeat, aggressive, major nuclear powers confronting us and our allies. Putin's Russia and Xi's China. Vladimir Putin seized Crimea in 2014 and in 2022 invaded Crimea, unleashing the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. He has rebuilt Russia's nuclear forces, including short and medium-range weapons, which he regularly uses to threaten both Ukraine and NATO. Since assuming power, he has violated 9 separate arms control pacts signed by his predecessors. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping has overseen the world's largest buildup of nuclear forces in decades. This Chinese leader skillfully wields this capability to back up his campaign of intimidating China's neighbors while laying claim to their territory, their exclusive economic zones, and much of the South China Sea. For those who recall history, today's world scene has more than a whiff of the late 1930s. Deterrence failed then. The Posture Commission makes clear that we cannot afford to let it fail now and recommends the way to ensure that it does not. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that concise and powerful warning. And also, Madelyn, thank you very much for your overview of the process of reviewing and coming up with your proposals. Daryl Kimball, you are the outspoken champion of nuclear arms agreements. But to have an agreement, you have to have a partner. Russia, as Madelyn said, suspended participation in the New START talks last year. They seem to be pressing at the edge of many other arms control treaties and heading to what might be breakout. And China is reluctant to hold talks as the junior-most member of the arms race with far fewer warheads than Russia or the United States. So how do you deal with partners who don't want to talk?
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's good to be with Frank and Madelyn. Good to see everybody on this lovely evening in Baltimore. So first, let me just, I'll come around to answering your question, Roy, as best I can. But on the main question that was posed to us, does the United States need more nuclear weapons? My short answer is no, we don't need more than we currently have. And I'll let the members of the Strategic Posture Commission speak for what the Posture Commission recommended. But if there were to be a buildup, I would argue that it would be unnecessary for U.S. deterrence and defense needs, counterproductive, and prohibitively expensive. But let me come back to your question, Roy, about the arms control situation, given the geostrategic tensions that have emerged over the last decade or so, which Madelyn and Frank both described quite well. I would just summarize it by saying that in the last decade, since the last U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control agreement, the New START agreement, which was concluded in 2010, we've seen the 3 states with the largest arsenals, relations deteriorating. We see each of them spending additional billions of dollars on nuclear weapons. And we are on the precipice of an unconstrained era of dangerous nuclear competition. As Frank and Madelyn said, several of the key U.S.-Russian arms control agreements that helped reduce tensions and win the peace after the end of the Cold War are either gone, being ignored, or in jeopardy. And Russia's brutal all-out invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and Putin's nuclear threat rhetoric has not only increased the danger of nuclear war, but it has led the Kremlin to short-circuit meaningful channels of diplomacy for nuclear risk reduction and avoiding miscalculation between the U.S. and NATO and Russia, and to reduce the risk of, and to maintain the key arms control agreements. And so, as was mentioned, in 2023, Russia suspended implementation of New START. That meant essentially that they were cutting off the on-site inspections. They were not continuing the data exchanges that are a key part of this agreement, but they publicly committed to adhere to the treaty's central limits. So what does this treaty do? It establishes ceilings on U.S. and Russian deployed strategic nuclear warheads at 1,550 on no more than 700 missiles at sea and on land and on bombers. But it will expire in 652 days from today, which is not long, and it's after a U.S. presidential election. Last year, because of this situation, last year, the President's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, spoke at my organization's annual meeting, delivered a speech in which he proposed talks without preconditions with Moscow and with Beijing on nuclear risk reduction and arms control. He said it's neither in the U.S. or Russian interest to embark on an open-ended competition in strategic forces, and the U.S. is prepared to stick to the central limits as long as Russia does. But the Russians, not surprisingly, but sadly, turned down the proposal by December because they said that the United States' hostility towards Russia and its support for Ukraine made the prospects of an outcome unlikely. So they're not talking. And yes, you do need to have a partner to negotiate an arms control agreement with, but there are options ahead, which I will try to talk about. China has, as we heard, stayed on the sidelines of the nuclear disarmament enterprise for the most part. They've joined multilateral agreements like the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Stop Nuclear Testing, but they've never been part of a bilateral nuclear arms control agreement like the United States and Russia have for almost over 50 years. And they have recently turned down a proposal to follow up the talks that began last fall between the U.S. and China on nuclear risk reduction. We'll see if they agree to meet again. So essentially, without some kind of new constraint, some sort of new agreement that further limits U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals, especially the strategic arsenals, each side could, in theory, I would not recommend this is not automatic, but they could double the number of deployed strategic nuclear weapons within 2 to 3 years by increasing the number of warheads on the existing land-based and sea-based systems that they have. And if the United States and Russia were to break out of those limits or to add other new systems and new warheads above their existing levels, it is more likely than not that China would look at this and further accelerate its ongoing nuclear buildup. And why are they doing this? We didn't discuss this. We might talk about this, but no one exactly knows why China is pursuing this buildup. But one reason could be that we have to consider is that it is trying to maintain its own nuclear retaliatory capability against the United States. So we need to consider what China's own concerns are as we deal with them in the future. So such a buildup would be a tragic mistake. The Strategic Posture Commission, as Madelyn and Frank said, essentially said the United States needs to be prepared to add more capability and flexibility to the U.S. strategic and conventional deterrent to deal with two near-peer adversaries. Some have suggested more specifically that the United States should increase the level of strategic warheads by some level. And there are others out there. The Heritage Foundation in particular has called for the next president to not to prepare, but to increase the size of the arsenal by loading more warheads on the land-based missiles, the sea-based missiles, to examine the feasibility of making the future intercontinental ballistic missile force mobile, road mobile instead of in fixed silos, et cetera. I disagree with these kinds of approaches. And in my view, in the view of my organization and many others looking at this issue, the actions by the Russians and the Chinese do not require the United States at this time to increase the overall size of our nuclear arsenal. And the challenge of two near-peer competitors, as the Strategic Posture Commission discovered through its substantial work and briefings, is far more complex than simple arithmetic. And one person who captured this, I think, quite well was Secretary of Defense Austin, who said in December 2022 that nuclear deterrence isn't just a numbers game. In fact, that sort of thinking can spur a dangerous arms race. So as I said, I think a buildup of U.S. nuclear forces in the next several years beyond our current levels would be unnecessary. And what do we have? Let's just remember that even though the U.S. force is, yes, older, we still have some 1,700 deployed thermonuclear warheads on 660 powerful long-range missiles on land and at sea, on strategic bombers, plus about 200 gravity bombs dropped from airplanes, fighter bombers, on shorter-range aircraft. Russia has a strategic force that's roughly equivalent in number and lethality. It does have a larger number of shorter-range nuclear weapons, the so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Many of these are in storage, but they have somewhere close to 10 times the number of tactical nuclear warheads the United States does. China, as was said before, has right now an estimated 500 nuclear weapons total. About 310 of those are on long-range missiles, but it could grow. So we just need to put all these numbers in perspective and remember that just a fraction, the use of just a fraction of these weapons would lead to utter catastrophe and devastation on a global scale. And only China, for what it's worth, has formally declared that it will not be the first to use nuclear weapons. So, when it comes to the question of, is that enough? How much is enough? I would argue that that is already more than enough, even if China's arsenal grows, and even if Russia's arsenal would grow by some modest amount. Because once nuclear adversaries achieve an assured destruction capability, which the United States, Russia, and China have already done, and China, frankly, has achieved that for many years, expanding their forces or acquiring new capabilities will not lead to more effective deterrence. So the other reason why I think the buildup would be unfortunate is it would be counterproductive for all sides. I would agree with Frank that the United States is not spurring an arms race and that Russia has been modernizing its forces for some time, and China is clearly increasing the overall size of its arsenal. If each of these three near-peer adversaries start new deployments, increasing their numbers, we will see an action-reaction cycle in which each is responding to the other. And in that situation, we do have an unconstrained three-way arms race that no one, quite frankly, can win. Now, the other reason why I think we need to be mindful about the possibility of a larger number of U.S. nuclear weapons in the years ahead is it would be prohibitively expensive. Keep in mind that today, to pursue the program of record, as it's called, that the Biden administration has continued to pursue to modernize the existing U.S. nuclear arsenal, out of the $850 billion defense budget that just went to Congress a few weeks ago for fiscal 2025, about $69 billion of that is for nuclear weapons operations, sustainment, and modernization. And that's an increase of about 22% over the previous year. And so some of the costs of these key systems are going up and up. The new Sentinel ICBM system, this is a new missile that would be put into refurbished silos where current U.S. Minuteman III missiles are already deployed, 400 of them. This program is projected to cost about $756 billion over the next decade, and the Pentagon just had to notify the Congress that there was a 37% cost increase in the program, which requires a cost review. And so as those costs increase, if we add more nuclear weapons, and the cost would certainly increase if there are new delivery systems, new warheads added, even more uploads on the existing systems, that puts pressure on our ability to fund other urgent defense needs, including conventional force needs and projection of our forces and other human security needs. What we need to do in the long run, in my view, and getting back to the strategy for arms control and restraint, is we need to redouble our efforts in this regard. The United States needs to continue to make it clear that we are ready to engage with Russia or China, and China, because for more than 50 years, this has been an essential part. It hasn't been an end, but it's been an essential part of the strategy of U.S. presidents, Republicans and Democrats, to constrain adversary capabilities that can threaten the U.S. or allies, and to lessen the risk of nuclear war, to help the adversaries manage their nuclear competition as they move forward. So that's why the posture review, the nuclear posture review put together by the Biden administration states that mutual verifiable nuclear arms control offers the most effective, durable, and responsible path to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy and prevent their use. And so, you know, this was the idea at the heart of National Security Advisor Sullivan's speech, calling for unconditional talks with Russia and China on nuclear risk reduction and arms control. And specifically, he suggested that the U.S. and Russia negotiate a new nuclear arms control framework agreement before 2026 arrives. Now, clearly, in good times, negotiating a new complex treaty agreement with the Russians would be difficult. Getting such a treaty through the Senate, which requires 67 votes for ratification, is difficult in good times. And in these days, the U.S. Senate can't agree that today is Wednesday, right? So the possibilities of negotiating a complex nuclear arms control agreement with Russia before 2026 arrives and getting the Duma and the Senate to ratify, the odds are steep, to say the least. So considering all of that, I think one of the things that we need to consider, and I think the Russians need to consider and will consider, is that while the war in Ukraine continues, as relations continue to be sour, and as difficult as formal agreements are to get through the Senate, the two sides should consider another form of arms control, which is that each agree not to exceed the limits established by the New START Treaty, 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, until such time as a new nuclear arms control arrangement is effected. One problem with this is that the verification provisions are not there. We don't have them now, but we have some powerful national technical means of intelligence that can allow us to have, with good confidence, an idea of how many nuclear weapons the Russians have deployed on their strategic systems and vice versa. So that's one approach I think we need to be thinking about in these exceedingly difficult times to try to head off the potential for an unconstrained three-way nuclear arms race, if not in the very near future, down the line. So let me stop there, and let me thank Frank and Madelyn and Roy and all of you for being here, and I'm sure you got questions about these things and maybe completely different nuclear weapons-related questions, which I'm happy to answer.
Daryl, thank you so much. If members of the audience have questions, could you line up here at the speaker stand, at the mic stand, and I'll pass the mic over. First of all, though, I should ask Madelyn and Frank if you have any responses, or if anybody wants to respond to what was said here in our opening remarks.
So first, obviously, I completely agree with Daryl on the sense that it would be very, very difficult to actually get a real arms control treaty with either Russia or China in the current environment, and who knows when that environment will improve. The other thing I think we have to be very, very careful of when we talk about increasing numbers is that's a bit it's very easy to talk about we don't want to increase numbers, but the U.S. has a total stockpile number, and then there are limitations under the New START Treaty. The U.S. also has warheads that are not deployed that we refer to as the hedge. And the reason these warheads are there is in case there is an adverse geopolitical event. It's our backup. It's our safety net, if you will, at some level, so that we can still project a credible nuclear deterrent. And after all, nuclear deterrent is the backbone of all our deterrence, and the conventional deterrence has to come first. But what the Commission talked about specifically is the possibility after New START expires, if the trajectories of Russia and China continue, is to use some of our hedge weapons and upload. In other words, put a few more on the ICBMs, the sea-launched ballistic missiles. So in my mind, that isn't increasing the size of the stockpile because it's the stockpile we already have. It's using them in a bit of a different way. So we have to be very careful when we talk about increasing numbers.
Okay, five quick points. As to cost, even the figures Daryl cited say that the modernization and sustainment, which is to say the day-to-day operations of our nuclear forces, constitute 7% of the defense budget. 7%. That's enough to prevent a nuclear war. Second, talking about arms control agreements, Putin has violated, systematically destroyed 9 arms control agreements over the last 20 years. Systematically destroyed them, overtly and covertly. This is not a man you can do business with at this point. Third, the concept of strategic nuclear arms control is an anachronism. Putin has about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. Those are the weapons he would use first. Those are the weapons he uses to threaten Ukraine and to threaten our NATO allies. And if there is to be a new treaty, it's got to be comprehensive. It's got to be all nuclear weapons. Some people don't like that because that's more than 1550. But that is a realistic arms control agreement which covers all of the weapons, including those that might be used first. And I've already talked about an arms race. I disagree that there's any such thing as an arms race. But finally, and most importantly, 2010 is not 2024. If you have a security situation in 2010 where Russia is not a threat and China is not in the discussion, and you move into a world where Russia is a threat and China is a threat, you're in a very different world. And your security posture, both your conventional forces and your nuclear forces, have to reflect that. And that's where the commission came out without coming up with a number.
Well, just to help folks get a sense of some of the numbers we're throwing around, Madelyn was talking about the hedge arsenal. I mean, the United States has about 5,000 active nuclear warheads in its total arsenal. It deploys, that is, on systems that could be launched within hours, days, weeks, about 1,770, plus 200 tactical nuclear weapons. So I would just say, Madelyn, that it is a little, it's some funny math to say that, you know, if we're going to increase the number of warheads on strategic delivery systems, it's not changing the size of our arsenal. That is true if we're counting the total arsenal. But our adversaries are looking at how many deployed nuclear weapons we have. We're looking at how many deployed nuclear weapons they have. So that's what we need to be cognizant of. I would just point out, Franken, that yes, Russia has, I mean, my organization has been extremely critical of Russia for what it's done to the arms control regime. But when it comes to the tactical nuclear weapons, having 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons doesn't make Russia any safer. We have about 200 nuclear weapons. If tactical nuclear weapons are used in a conflict in Europe, let's say, it's the first 2, okay, or the first 20 that are going to matter. Because after that point, the two sides are going to be in a massive war that could escalate. So the fact that Russia has 2,000, you know, it matters in the sense that we got to keep track of them. But in terms of the potential for conflict, you know, the bean counting needs to be taken into consideration.
The Russians think differently. Sorry? The Russians think differently.
The other thing I would point out is we actually have somewhere along the line of 3,500 active warheads. The rest of them are
in reserve.
Well, no, they're not even reserve. They're in the queue for dismantlement. But the other big difference that we haven't talked about is the U.S. has no ability right now to produce a new nuclear weapon, and both China and Russia do.
So let's go to the first question. And do you have questions there, Sam? Okay, let's.
Yeah.
Sure.
You haven't addressed it at all, no insult, but we were very much impressed with what Israel did a week ago, where they destroyed 300 missiles coming in. what are we doing as a defensive thing? Are we doing anything to, I agree, we got X number of nuclear weapons. That's enough to destroy the world 3 times over. But we have to have a defense. And Israel was very impressive. I'd like your comments on that.
So probably 3 things on this. One, obviously, is the Israeli defenses that they were using were clearly defending against shorter range and conventional systems. Yeah, but they were, in other words, they were shorter range. In other words, they're not intercontinental range ballistic missiles. So our U.S. missile defense system is geared, they're located in Alaska and California. They are geared to basically defend against a rogue threat. In other words, they're basically designed to defend against an intercontinental range ballistic missile launched from North Korea or possibly Iran. They are by policy not designed to protect against either Russia or China. It is an absolute losing proposition if we were to deploy sufficient ground-based interceptors in Alaska and California to defend against Russia and China. Plus, it would undermine their strategic deterrent and would cause even more consternation and strategic instability. What the commission did talk about, though, was because of the relationship with our allies and how important our allies are to us and us to them, one of the things that we do not have is we do not have any ability to defend against some sort of a coercive attack, a very small attack. We don't have any real capability to defend some of our critical infrastructure, like the Kings Bay ballistic missile submarine base in Georgia. So what the commission recommended is that we look seriously at defending these critical infrastructure, these critical bases against a coercive attack. What I mean by coercive attack is an attack that comes after some sort of a regional event. Maybe it's China-Taiwan, maybe it's Russia-Ukraine or Russia-NATO. But these sorts of attacks against the U.S. would be aimed to try and keep the U.S. out of the fight, keep the U.S. from coming to the aid of its allies, preventing the U.S. from doing something. So we did talk about that a lot, about making sure that we have the ability to defend these critical assets.
And I think the other thing I want to do is I just want to completely reject what you said about destroying the world 3 times over. That's not what deterrence is all about. Deterrence is about saying to Xi and to Putin, you should not use nuclear weapons, short range, medium range, or long range. That number goes up, that number goes down. It went down quite low at the end of the Cold War. It's now at a lowest number it's been at in several decades. There's a question as to whether it should go up somewhat more, given the fact that we are now in a 2-peer threat versus a no-threat situation from 2010. But characterizations like blowing the world up 3 times over doesn't help. It just clouds the issue.
So my understanding of the defense of Israel, since that was brought up, was the U.S. and Saudi Arabia both participated in that? That wasn't my question. Franklin, you painted a kind of a bleak picture of the U.S. keeping up with Russia and China. It's a 2-part question. Did it have anything to do with the U.S. being ahead of them? And the second part of that is in this mutually assured destruction world, does it matter? Kind of.
So, yes, it matters. First of all, we weren't ahead. We decided that there was a no-threat world and there were other things to spend money on. And so, as I said, because the force is generally modernized at 20-year intervals, it should have been modernized in the George W. Bush administration, as was not. The Minuteman force that we have today was first deployed in the 1970s. Parts of it are still safe, but not particularly. Their lifespan is short. The strategic missile submarines that we have been operating longer than any U.S. submarine in history. The air-launched cruise missile on our bombers was deployed in 1982 with a design life of 10 years. These systems are old and are falling apart at some point, and if you don't replace them, you get out of the deterrence business, and that's the stark choice. You modernize the systems or you get out of the deterrence business. Obviously, we believe that they need to be modernized.
There's several questions from James Wagner, and I'm going to try and put them together. But basically, he is coming from the position that we should be negotiating more rather than less. And his point is, and James, I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting you, but that there's some windows of opportunity. For example, when China and Russia both said that they're either no first use or they're going to abide by parts of the START treaty, are we making best use of those windows of opportunity to negotiate?
The no first use pledge is a farce. The Russians had the Soviets had a no first use pledge. And then when we got their books, when the Berlin Wall fell, and we got the Soviet army plans from the East Germans, Russian warplanes called for first use. If you look at what the Chinese are doing with their force today, it's quite clear that they are postured to use nuclear weapons first, depending on what the leader decides. The difference between no first use and first use is what the leader decides at the moment. So this stuff about a no first use pledge is built on sand.
The debate about whether a political pledge not to use nuclear weapons first is valuable or not has been debated since almost the beginning of nuclear weapons time. But the question was about, are we using our diplomatic opportunities? I could go back over the last 20 years and I could point to a number of lost and missed opportunities on the part of the Russians as well as the Americans. We are where we are. And where we are at the moment is that Vladimir Putin has prioritized his war against Ukraine as the number 1, 2, and 3 priority. He is trying to use every lever he has in order to try to gain an advantage in that conflict, including by shutting down most lines of communication with the U.S. about arms control and risk reduction. That may begin to change as we get closer to the end of New START, as the situation in Ukraine changes one way or another, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. It's very worrisome. China at the moment is wondering, I think, whether a strategic dialogue on nuclear weapons with the United States is worthwhile. It is not clear, I think, what the Chinese buildup is about and whether they have a strategy and for a unified strategy for pursuing more nuclear weapons. There seemed to be some uncertainty within the Chinese system about this that we and others can detect. We have to understand what the Chinese concerns are and motivations are for engaging in dialogue on nuclear risk reduction. There was a meeting on November 6th at a mid-level. There's an interview that we just conducted with the Assistant Secretary of State, Mallory Stewart, who was in that meeting for our journal Arms Control Today, which is online. So I'd take a look at that. That'll give you a flavor for the state of U.S. efforts to engage with Russia and China at this time. But we need to continue to press the case and make it clear that it's not the United States that's the problem with respect to pursuing arms control diplomacy at the present time.
Bob Freeman, one of our board members, he says, is U.S. deterrence working today?
Yes.
That's a short answer.
But the other question is, this is not something that's necessarily guaranteed to continue to work ad infinitum. And if nuclear deterrence fails, the risks are catastrophic. And I agree with Frank, the point is to avoid that. But just because we haven't had nuclear use since August 9th, 1945, is no guarantee that the risk isn't there. And it's higher today because of Russia's war in Ukraine.
But conventional deterrence is the backbone, is part of this continuum. But the conventional deterrence is a huge part of this question, right?
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that, one of the other questions is, there are some threats of tactical nuclear weapons from Russia. what means do we have to deter that?
So again, I think we have to start on this continuum. So conventional deterrence is absolutely essential, and we need to increase our conventional capabilities for both the European and the Indo-Pacific theater. We don't have enough of either, and they're different in each theater. Because fundamentally, if we have the ability to prevent the conventional war, then we have the ability, hopefully, to prevent the nuclear war on the assumption that it starts out conventional in a regional context, and that's when it goes nuclear because there is a concern by one of the parties. In this case, I'm assuming it could very well be Russia, that their leadership is at risk, and they would go conventional. Or they would go nuclear. So fundamentally, you have to instill in Russia and in China that any aggression is not worth the cost, and that they will not achieve their goals. But it starts with conventional deterrence.
Could it just what we don't need to match Russia's tactical nuclear weapons. Russia has 2,000 nuclear weapons. God and Putin only know why. I don't. We need a modest number of tactical nuclear weapons or intermediate range nuclear weapons in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific theater, so that the Russians do not believe that they can, because there's a sort of a stalemate at the intercontinental level, that they could get away with using weapons in the theater against our allies. And that's what this is all about. And we do not, I say again, do not need to match their numbers. However, if there's an arms control agreement, it needs to capture all of those weapons.
What are the conventional recommendations, and doesn't a position of deterrence require a position of strength that calculates both the Chinese and Russian numbers, thereby requiring an increase in what we have?
So one of the things that, or probably one of the fundamental things of this report, is it highlights a number of the issues. It highlights the changes in the geostrategic environment, and it puts a lot of homework at the feet of this administration and the next administration, because there's a huge amount of analysis that has to be done. What is it? What is it that, and how many do we need to deter both Russia and China? And that analysis has yet to be done. So when we looked at everything, we found some areas where we were convinced that there were gaps. Some is in the context of these regional capabilities that Frank mentioned, but there's a big gap in the conventional capabilities. We don't have enough tankers. We don't have enough hypersonic systems. I mean, there's a very large gap in our conventional. So if you ask me, where should the focus and attention be? Over and above maintaining and sustaining the modernization programs that we have right now and the infrastructure that goes with it, it really should be on the conventional capabilities.
Does that include like increases in the Navy, the
Not
Army?
necessarily. I mean, we didn't recommend more divisions and more carrier battle groups. I mean, there are two different wars. There's a land war in Europe, and there's a naval and maritime war in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we're in many ways well postured for that, with the exception of the capabilities that Madelyn just mentioned. But there's another important point. Deterrence means that we have to have enough of our own weapons to hold at risk, that is, to threaten to destroy what Putin and Xi value. After that, it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons the other guy has. We need to have a finite number, which is determined by the target selection. If they have 5,000, I don't really care if I can cover my target base successfully, and they know that. And this is what we're calling on the Biden administration to do. Figure out how many weapons you need, then go into an arms control agreement that can then maintain that level that you need and put constraints on everything else.
It seems to me that, I've forgotten the name, Mr. Killian, I believe, is talking about increases or not increases in kilotonnage, and that you are talking about improvements and modernizations of delivery systems. Much has happened since 2010 in terms of capability of delivery systems. Nor, if I'm correct, I don't think there was such a thing as an anti-missile missile then. The question is, were you to shoot down a nuclear weapon, what occurs to the nuclear material that falls?
There are obviously a bunch of different scenarios, but if you take the U.S. land-based interceptors, which are also being replaced for the next generation interceptors, the idea is that an intercept would knock it off course. It's not an explosive interceptor; it's a kinetic kill. So it knocks it off course. In space, exoatmospheric. So it's outside of the atmosphere, and it knocks it off course. And then, if it would re-enter the atmosphere, it would burn up. But this is a topic for which there's a huge amount of research and study and a lot of understanding. But it's also one of the reasons why it's important to understand that it is a kinetic kill. It's a kinetic kill. It's going like this. The incoming's going like this, and the goal is to hit it outside the atmosphere.
Daryl.
Just one small point. Frank just ended a couple minutes ago by saying that the commission is urging the administration to outline a strategy for how many nuclear weapons the United States might need to deal with two near-peer competitors. They are, and actually have completed something called a nuclear weapons employment guidance document, which is something that the Pentagon puts together on the basis of policy guidance from the president. I think they're in the process of reviewing that, and we may be learning more about that by the end of the year. I think the administration is also preparing to outline what they would like to talk about with Russia with respect to a new nuclear arms control framework if the Russians were to sit down and talk with the United States. So we may see more about all these things in the coming months.
Sounds like a pretty big if. So I think this is a very thorough discussion tonight, a deep discussion, and a very disturbing discussion. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us and the Zoom audience. And thank you indeed to the panelists, Madelyn, Frank, and Daryl. It was superb. Thank you so much on behalf of the Baltimore Council.